It's been over a week since Russian troops entered Ukraine in what was dubbed a special operation. A drastic escalation has, however, pushed the military adventure into a full-blown conflict. The conflict in Ukraine has divided the world. In retaliation, the US and its NATO allies have slapped Russia with a wide range of sanctions. Europe is now staring at a potentially disruptive humanitarian crisis. But how will this impact Africa? And what lessons can Africa draw from this crisis? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, let's now bring on board our panel of experts to give further insight on the effects of the conflict in Ukraine to Africa. In London, I'm joined by Charlie Robertson, Global Chief Economist at Renaissance Capital, Pauline Bax, Deputy Director of the Africa Programme at the International Crisis Group, and Dr. Filani Muthembu, Executive Director at the Institute for Global Dialogue associated with the University of South Africa. Thank you all for being a part of this discussion. I want to start off with the security implications of the Ukraine crisis. And Dr. Thembu, if I may start off with you, because Kenya's permanent representative to the UN, Martin Kimani, in his speech to the UN on the Ukrainian crisis, pointed out that, and I quote, multilateralism lies on its deathbed, end quote. Is that your assessment as well?
Well, the fundamental challenge here is an issue of multilateralism and the institutions that it has available. We've seen throughout the pandemic that multilateralism has essentially been on its deathbed. Countries have taken nationalist positions, whether it comes to procurement, whether it comes to distribution of vaccines and other medical equipment. So multilateral infrastructure has not enabled the world to cooperate more. And the great example here has been through the pandemic. When we lay it out to peace and security mechanisms, also whether it's the UN Security Council and other structures, these institutions, the confidence and trust has been eroded in these institutions consistently through wars such as your coalitions of the willing, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's in Afghanistan, and these have eroded progressively the international cooperation system. And we're also seeing that today. So a failure to resolve this conflict through peaceful mechanisms have also shown a challenge of multilateralism.
Pauline, now confidence and trust has been eroded, as Dr. Nthembu says there. I mean, through continuous wars and a failure to resolve conflicts peacefully. Is it your assessment, though, that multilateralism lies on its deathbed?
Yes, I think the implication of saying that it lies on its deathbed means it's not really in its grave yet, technically. I think we should note that the UN system has responded very strongly to the crisis in Ukraine. On Wednesday, in Wednesday's vote at the UN General Assembly, there were 141 votes for the resolution, which was a record. And there's a very clear sense among a large majority of UN member states that Russia's attack on Ukraine is an attack on the UN Charter, and that these countries should do everything they can to defend the UN system. But if we, all that said, the UN resolution will have probably very little impact because the UN does not have any tools. And if the war drags on, it will make it much harder for the P5 to cooperate on other issues at the UN, for example, Syria and Afghanistan. And the big question is if this will spill over into UN diplomacy in Africa. So I think it's too early to say that multilateralism is dead, but the troops are rallying either in favor of Russia or against Russia. So there's definitely countries coming together to express their votes. Not so much in Africa, where a lot of countries have taken a neutral position, but you see this large mobilization pro or against across the world.
Right. Charlie, let me hear your thoughts here, because, a precedent had already been set, though. It's not just about Russia, Ukraine. A precedent had been set before. And to quote Kenya's ambassador again, Kimani, he said, the Charter of the United Nations continues to wield under the relentless assault of the powerful. And of course, if we look back, we've seen this happen before with NATO in Libya, with the US in Afghanistan. Yeah. Is there meaningful progress, though, in preventing these unilaterally, military campaigns at the UN level?
And no, and that is partly economic. If you go back 20 years, 30 years, then you've got a hegemonic power, the US, which is able to impose, be the policeman of the world, or try to be. Fairly forceful policeman in a number of occasions, as you've just mentioned. And now you've got a much more divided global economy. China likely to overtake the United States in the early 2030s and be the biggest economy in the world. At that point, how can the US be the only policeman? And that change, and India's also rising. So the world is going to change, and it does make it harder.
Right. Dr. Nthembu, what's your thought, though? Is this an indictment of the international system at this point?
Well, it is, but it effectively shows that a key challenge, and this is not a new challenge, a key challenge of maintaining peace and security is that the UN system is as good as its membership, especially the UN Security Council. They play a disproportionate amount, both in causing conflicts, but also in preventing conflicts. The UN doesn't have an army, an independent army away from nation states. It relies on nation states. And when you have a situation when the great powers themselves do not adhere to the UN Charter, that makes it very difficult for other countries to actually enforce the UN Charter and to defend it when it needs to be defended.
Well, Pauline, that vote at the UN General Assembly, did how Africa votes surprise you, though? Does the African voice at the UN matter on the global stage in terms of influencing the course of events?
It won't necessarily influence the course of events right now, but I think it's important to note that at the UN Security Council, there are 3 African countries at the moment, Ghana, Gabon and Kenya, and they have made their voices heard in the run-up to the deliberations on the resolution on Wednesday. So I think that's very important, and especially Kenya's ambassador to the UN made a speech that resonated widely, maybe not across the world, but at least in New York and at the UN. He made a very impressive speech. Can African countries influence the course of events? Well, obviously they will not be able to do so. I think if we look at the countries who voted in favor, there was a clear divide at the vote on Wednesday between countries that voted in favor of backing the resolution, which was somehow fashioned on the continent as sort of a pro-Western vote. And there was also quite a number of African countries who abstained and who want to stay neutral in this debate.
Charlie, let me hear your thoughts here, particularly, when it comes to the simple terms. Though, how would an ordinary person on the streets in Nairobi or in Johannesburg or, in Dakar, for instance, how are they being affected by this conflict oceans away?
Well, go and fill up your car if you've got one. And you're seeing a 43, I've just checked the numbers, 43% increase in the oil price in Rand terms from the end of December until now. So just transportation is going to get more expensive. For North Africa, I think there's a real challenge about food prices. They're huge importers of cereals from Russia and from Ukraine, which are responsible for 1/3 of global exports of wheat. That's not going through Ukraine's ports right now. And it's got to be a question about how do you ensure get the insurance to transport that wheat to North Africa, or which ships are going to carry it, because Russian ships are getting banned from a whole host of ports globally. So there's a lot of challenges with shooting up prices for wheat, problems on insurance, problems on shipping, and food prices are 40% of the inflation basket in Egypt. 40% of what the average householder is spending is being spent on food. If that's going up, that's going to be a problem. Or it's a problem for the government. They're going to have to spend a load of money to subsidize food. And that causes problems with their budget. And Egypt's debt's already high. And if they've got a bigger budget deficit, you've got to a problem from that side. So food prices for those countries importing food, energy prices for anyone who's relying on electricity, on petrol. So people are going to feel this.
So we're looking at it this way, Charlie. We're looking at many African countries being on their path to recovery, post COVID pandemic. But now we're, you're talking about this new crisis again. Where do you think the biggest impact, though, will be felt in the short term?
Well, I mean, oddly, the biggest short-term impact will probably be felt for countries like Nigeria and Angola in a good way. Oil exports are booming, the oil price is booming, and those countries are going to be in a considerably better position ahead of Angola's elections and Nigeria's actually next year, and that's quite hopeful. And it's actually, so it's very good news for those countries that export the products where the price is going through the roof. And the pain for everybody else is spread out over many more people. So the biggest change is probably positive for some of those exporters like Nigeria and Angola, Republic of Congo, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea. There's a fair few.
All right, Dr. Nthembu, let me come back to you, though, with a few more of the security implications here, because we've heard from an economic perspective that Africa is very vulnerable to any global shock that hits the world. If an African country, though, were to face a crisis such as what is going on, some sort of external threat, does Africa have a continental security structure, though, to deal with it? What are Africa's vulnerabilities here?
Well, Africa's vulnerabilities is that, yes, on paper, we do have the African peace and security architecture, but the challenge is that most of that is largely funded externally. So if we look at Africa's Pan-African institutions, whether it's the African Union, whether it's the regional economic communities, and even a lot of the peacekeeping missions that are Africa-driven, much of the funding is actually coming externally, and that creates a vulnerability. So Africa does have a voice, but Africa's voice is enhanced when there's greater coordination and also when there's greater resource mobilization within Africa. We know that Africa, through illicit means, exports actually more funds, to the rest of the world than funds are coming in. So if you can actually cut off some of that, those illicit flows, and reinvest them towards Pan-African institutions, towards the peace and security architecture on the continent, that is how you reduce your vulnerabilities. And maybe just a last point is that whilst, yes, it's interesting to analyze sort of the vote dynamics within the continent. If you take, for instance, a country like South Africa, over 70% of its foreign direct investment is coming from Europe and the United States. However, South Africa abstained in this, and that is because South Africa generally tries to take a non-aligned posture in global politics, especially when it comes to the geopolitical conflicts of the great powers. And so what South Africa has advocated for is, rather than condemning one side or the other, is advocating for dialogue. And it's also calling out, yes, Russia on the one side, but it is also calling out NATO on the other side in terms of what contribution did NATO also play in leading to an escalation of this conflict.
Dr. Nthembu, geopolitically, though, I mean, with your reading of the situation, is this crisis now realigning the world?
It accelerates the realignment of the world. So the realignment has been taking place before, and the conflict is perhaps emblematic of that, because I think Russia would not have been in a position years ago to actually take such measures. However, if we think that the world is moving towards a multipolar world order, then it's clear that with different poles, there is a need for greater cooperation, and the US and its European allies cannot necessarily have their way on all matters. So we are moving towards a multilateral world order, and this is emblematic of that realignment.
All right, Pauline, given what you've talked about, some countries remaining neutral, some voting pro, what do you see, geopolitically? Are there geopolitical realignments, and what do this mean for Africa and Africa's security front, peace and security area?
There seems to be some concern that this current war will realign countries along old Cold War divides. So again, pro-Western votes or anti-Western votes, or pro-Russia against the West, as this, this conflict is now kind of framed as a European security matter that positions Europe and the US against Russia. And of course, there's the fear that this will polarize the African continent to an extent. You already see I wouldn't say a divide, but there are some countries who felt very comfortable coming out against the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and a lot of countries who feel sympathy for Russia or have historical ties with Russia and who didn't want to come out either way. Privately, a lot of African officials have expressed a lot of concern about the issue, but they just don't feel like they should come out in favor of either one at the moment.
We'll leave it there for the moment, but do stay with us. We'll take a short break and continue with this discussion in a moment. Don't go away. Well, those are some of the latest pictures there coming out of Ukraine. Welcome back to Talk Africa. My guests on standby, still with me, Charlie Robertson in London, Pauline Bax in Johannesburg, and Dr. Filani Nthembu in Kigali. Now let's continue with our discussion. Charlie, I want to look a bit at the economic fallout that this is occasioning, because according to the African Export-Import Bank, Africa and Russian trade is currently valued at about 20 billion US dollars. South Africa, for instance, which is a member of the BRICS, has investments in Russia amounting to nearly $5 billion. How is the economic fallout likely to play out between Russian and African trade?
Yeah, it's been really interesting. Russia's managed to boost its exports a great deal to Africa. It's running a big trade surplus with Africa. So it's doing well by selling weapons, selling food to North Africa, and perhaps a little bit of energy as well. But I think it was more weapons than food. And that's presumably going to continue. A little bit more complicated, a little bit more paperwork. That's likely to continue. On the import side, in terms of what Russia's buying from Africa, probably a little less. But for the globe and kind of the global disruption from this, it's actually impossible to put numbers on everything. The oil price is moving too fast. The global wheat prices are moving too fast. Fertilizer prices are affected. Shipping rates are likely to be affected. Literally everything. And the news on sanctions is coming in on a daily basis. So we don't know quite how bad this is going to be. It's looking like the Fed is saying not an awful lot of change in policy from the US on interest rates. The US economy is not so directly affected by this. But nonetheless, I think the markets haven't yet been able to price it in. I can't price it all in.
But we are already seeing the oil prices surging past the $100 per barrel. I mean, hitting their highest level since 2014. In terms of the unintended consequences for the continent as a result of this, what do you foresee?
The difficulty is, I think it's impossible to foresee at the moment. And potentially there's a reasonable deal. Well, it depends on your perspective, but the deal that Putin wanted a month ago is what he gets. And things calm down. Russia stays sanctioned, but then the concerns over oil prices, oil would probably go back to the 90s, possibly the 80s. That process could start tomorrow. So at this stage, it's just actually impossible to say.
All right.
I think.
Dr. Ntembu, what's the reaction here from Africa, though? How concerned is Africa when it comes to the economic front as well?
Well, if we factor in that prior to the pandemic, for about 2 decades, we had at least 6 or 7 of the fastest growing economies, of the top 10 fastest growing economies were African economies. And these were economies that were not only commodity dependent. So you've had rapid economic growth on the continent prior to the pandemic. And the hope was that now we are moving towards a recovery. And that these economies will again regain their momentum. The challenge now is that much of the diplomatic energy from Europe and also from the US will be directed towards Europe, will be directed towards Ukraine. And depending on how protracted this conflict is, it means that there will be a reprioritization of focus, and Africa will not necessarily receive as much focus as it did. What that will likely do is continue this drive towards building regional value chains. One of the key challenges in Africa is that it is too vulnerable to external crises. And the pandemic has shown us that the continent has to invest in regional value chains, not to insulate itself from the world, but to make it more resilient when crises emerge.
Charlie, let's look at the gas prices, for instance, here, because analysts have pointed out that the potential for the gas market, particularly for Africa here, because sub-Saharan Africa has about 221.6 trillion cubic feet of proven natural gas reserves. If Europe was to find an alternative to Russian gas, where would Africa stand here? Are there, feasible opportunities for African states?
There's a whole load of hydroenergy, hydrocarbon excitement about West Africa at the moment, Senegal, Mauritania. And yes, I do think that what will be interesting about that would be that Africa would be seen as a reliable energy supplier, a reliable partner that isn't going to carry the same geopolitical risks for its partners that Russia does at the moment. So no, I think Africa could do well to try and replace that. You've got the Mozambique kind of LNG story as well. Tanzania had hopes for it, and if the price is high enough, that becomes economic again, that offshore natural gas story out of Tanzania. So yes, plenty of opportunities. Long run, what I'd love to see would be Africa exporting solar power, electricity from renewables. Both actually first, most importantly, to foster industrialization across the continent, but secondly, potentially enough for some export across to Southern Europe. So I'd be hopeful that in the longer run, there's going to be an awful lot more investment on the continent.
Right, so it does seem that there's a lot of opportunities here as well. Pauline, I want to get your view here. What lessons are there from this crisis? From where you're sitting, there have been opportunities discussed by the other analysts on this panel. What lessons can Africa learn from this crisis? How best can we prepare, though, if something similar arises in the future?
The lesson for Africa here is that African countries could consider strengthening multilateralism on the continent and building up the African Union. It will be essential for African countries to band together now in this period of great global uncertainty and possibly predatory behavior by big powers. Africa needs to build up buffers for possible economic shocks, as it's just been trying to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. And as it's clear, as we discussed earlier, that there will be an economic fallout of this war in terms of grain and wheat supply and food prices and oil prices possibly going up. Specifically, I think for states in the Sahel, such as Mali, specifically Mali and countries like Sudan and Central African Republic, this may also be a lesson that there's a risk in putting all your eggs in one basket in terms of security assistance, which these countries have recently done by signing multilateral or bilateral cooperation agreements with Moscow, because this war will very likely distract Russia, and there's really no guarantee that these countries will get the security support they were hoping they were going to get.
Dr. Nthembu, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think I appreciate sort of this balanced view in a sense that on the one side, yes, there are big challenges that will ensue. So rising prices, whether it's food, but also energy. But on the other side, a continent looking at the opportunities. And I think that's what we need to be focused on. Whether it's Algeria also sending gas to Southern Europe. I think these are some of the opportunities and conversations that we need to be having on the continent, because a big challenge for Africa in recent or in previous decades is that it has been following events rather than proactively looking at capitalizing from events, whether it's negative crises or whether it's positive events that happen. And one of the areas that I've been highlighting is really around building of regional value chains, industrialization on the continent, attracting investment in those areas, and making, yes, Africa a more reliable geopolitical actor that is less prone to risk, but that is also well located geographically to access markets both in Asia but also in Europe and the Americas and the Middle East. So I think this is what the continent needs to be thinking. It needs to be thinking much more strategically about how to benefit from events that are shaping the world.
Charlie, you have the final word on this, yes.
Well, what struck me watching a video by the realist thinker Mearsheimer, he did about an hour-long lecture about why Ukraine was going to end up being invaded, and in 2015, and he said, look, there's always a long-term set of tension and then a trigger for that tension to erupt. And so I think the lessons for Africa or for anywhere is look at where these long-term tensions are lying. And maybe it's between Morocco and Algeria, where you've seen Algeria cut off gas supply to Spain to get at Morocco just a couple of months ago. Or look at some of the civil strife happening in parts of Nigeria, which have been going on now for years. Look at the problems in Mozambique. Don't assume that just because something hasn't kicked off in a terrible way, it isn't going to in 6 months or 18 months when the right trigger comes along. So I guess we can't ignore places of tension, places of conflict, and just hope that it goes away.
All right, a very interesting discussion there, but that's all time we have for this week on the program. A big thank you to my guests for their insights on this subject. In London, Charlie Robertson, Global Chief Economist at Renaissance Capital. In Johannesburg, Pauline Bax, Deputy Director of the Africa Program at the International Crisis Group. And in Kigali, Dr. Phiilani Nthembu, Executive Director at the Institute for Global Dialogue, associated with the University of South Africa. Now remember to engage us further on this subject through our social media platforms on Twitter and Facebook, and also catch this and more episodes of the program on our YouTube playlist. See you again next time. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Goodbye.